Welcome to this journey through one of the most chilling cases of medical betrayal in American history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will shake your trust in the healthcare system in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that claimed 45 innocent lives, where a trusted pharmacist defied all ethical boundaries and left a legacy so horrifying that an entire community would question everyone they thought they knew. It was the year 1999. The world was holding its breath for Y2K, celebrating the end of a millennium while anxiously anticipating technological collapse. But in Kansas City, Missouri, a different kind of catastrophe was already unfolding. Silent, deliberate, and utterly unthinkable. The late 90s were a time of pharmaceutical revolution. Prozac had transformed mental health treatment. Viagra had just hit the market. Americans were consuming more prescription medications than ever before, trusting an elaborate system of checks and balances designed to keep them safe. Pharmacists stood as the final guardians in this chain of trust-educated professionals who verified dosages, checked for dangerous interactions, and ensured that the pills dispensed matched the doctor's orders exactly. But what happens when that guardian becomes a predator? What happens when the person responsible for your health decides, with cold calculation, to become the architect of your death? Kansas City in the late 1990s was a sprawling metropolitan area straddling the border between Missouri and Kansas, a city of fountains and jazz history, of stockyards and suburban expansion. The Research Medical Tower stood in the heart of the medical district, a gleaming complex where thousands of patients sought treatment for everything from routine ailments to life-threatening conditions. The hospital pharmacy, located on the second floor, was a sterile, fluorescent, lit space where hundreds of prescriptions were filled each day, a conveyor belt of healing that operated with mechanical precision. Robert Courtney had worked as a pharmacist for over 2 decades by the time he purchased the Research Medical Tower Pharmacy in 1998. He was 51 years old, a respected figure in Kansas City's medical community. Colleagues described him as meticulous, professional, and deeply knowledgeable. He attended community events. He coached youth sports. He sat in church every Sunday with his wife and 2 daughters, the picture of suburban respectability. His pharmacy was profitable, well-regarded, and busy. Doctors trusted him. Patients returned to him year after year. Insurance companies processed his claims without question. He had built something impressive, a thriving business in a competitive field, a reputation that opened doors, a life that seemed beyond reproach. But beneath this veneer of success, Robert Courtney was harboring a secret that would eventually reveal him as one of the most prolific medical criminals in American history. The pharmaceutical industry operates on trust. When a doctor writes a prescription for chemotherapy specifically, when they prescribe drugs like Taxol or Gems are to cancer patients fighting for their lives, they trust that the pharmacist will prepare the medication according to exact specifications. These aren't pills in a bottle. Chemotherapy drugs arrive as concentrated solutions that must be diluted with precise measurements, mixed with sterile fluids, and prepared in specific dosages calculated to the patient's body weight and cancer type. The margins are razor thin. Too much chemotherapy and the patient suffers catastrophic side effects: organ failure, immune system collapse, death. Too little, and the cancer continues to grow, metastasizing through the body while the patient believes they're being treated. Robert Courtney understood these margins perfectly. He had studied pharmacology. He knew oncology. He understood exactly what would happen if he altered these life-saving medications. And he did it anyway. The dilution began sometime in the early 1990s, according to later investigations, though the exact starting point would never be fully determined. Courtney's method was devastatingly simple. When preparing chemotherapy medications, drugs that cost hundreds or thousands of dollars per dose, he would use only a fraction of the prescribed amount, sometimes as little as 5% of what the doctor had ordered. A prescription calling for 100 milligrams of Taxol, Courtney would use 5 milligrams, then fill the Roman 4 bag with saline solution. The liquid looked identical, the volume was correct, the label matched the prescription perfectly, and the patient, already weakened by cancer and expecting to feel terrible from chemotherapy, would receive their treatment and go home, never knowing they'd been poisoned by absence rather than presence. The cancer patients of Kansas City were dying, but cancer patients die. That's the terrible arithmetic of oncology. Not everyone survives, despite the best treatments and the most aggressive interventions. When Margaret Hayes succumbed to breast cancer in 1997, after 18 months of chemotherapy, her family grieved but didn't question. The doctors had warned them. Survival rates, even with treatment, weren't guaranteed. When Thomas Chen's lymphoma returned with vicious speed despite regular treatments, his oncologist adjusted the protocol and tried different drugs. Cancer was unpredictable. Sometimes it developed resistance. Sometimes it was simply too aggressive. When 43-year-old Sarah Rodriguez died, leaving 2 young children, her husband's anger had nowhere to direct itself except at the disease that had stolen his wife. The chemotherapy had made her so sick, the nausea, the hair loss, the exhaustion so profound she could barely lift her head. Surely the treatment had been real. Surely everything possible had been done. But the treatment wasn't real. The chemotherapy that was supposed to save these patients, that made them violently ill with side effects, that cost their families tens of thousands of dollars and gave them hope even in darkest moments, it was mostly salt water. The side effects they experienced, those came from the tiny amounts of actual chemotherapy drugs present, just enough to create symptoms, but nowhere near enough to fight their cancers. Their bodies were reacting to poison while being denied the cure. For years, this continued. Courtney filled thousands of prescriptions. He billed insurance companies for full-strength medications while dispensing fractions. The profits were staggering. He pocketed an estimated $19 million over the course of his scheme. He bought luxury cars. He purchased a boat. He took elaborate vacations. His daughters attended private schools. His home expanded with renovations, and his patients died. The unraveling began not with law enforcement or regulatory agencies, but with a doctor's nagging suspicion and a sales representative's careful attention to patterns. Dr. Verda Hunter was an oncologist at the Research Medical Center, a physician who'd spent decades treating cancer patients with every tool modern medicine could offer. She was methodical, data-driven, and deeply troubled by what she was seeing in her practice during the late 1990s. Her patients weren't responding to treatment the way they should. Cancers that should have shrunk remained stable or grew. Survival rates seemed lower than expected. Something felt wrong, but cancer was unpredictable enough that she couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Then there was Robert Dilley, a sales representative for Eli Lilly, the pharmaceutical company that manufactured Gemzar, one of the chemotherapy drugs Courtney dispensed regularly. Dilley's job was to track sales, build relationships with pharmacies and hospitals, and ensure his company's products were reaching patients. He noticed something strange in Courtney's purchasing patterns. Courtney's pharmacy was filling a huge number of prescriptions for Gemzar, hundreds of doses. But his orders from Eli Lilly didn't match. he was buying far less of the concentrated drug than would be needed to fill all those prescriptions at full strength. The numbers didn't add up. In late 1999, Dilly began investigating. He cross-referenced prescription records with purchase orders. He calculated expected usage versus actual orders. The discrepancy was massive. Either Courtney had found some other supplier, which seemed unlikely given the controlled nature of these medications, or he was diluting the drugs dramatically. Dilly contacted Dr. Hunter. Together, they brought their concerns to the hospital administration and, eventually, to the FBI. On August 21, 2000, federal agents executed a search warrant at Courtney's pharmacy. They arrived early, before the morning rush of patients, moving through the space with methodical precision. In the back room where medications were prepared, they found Courtney's workspace, a counter cluttered with vials, Roman IV bags, syringes, and mixing equipment. They seized records. They confiscated computers. They took samples of every chemotherapy preparation Courtney had recently mixed. The testing revealed the truth in stark, numerical terms. Vial after vial contained chemotherapy drugs diluted to fractions of their prescribed strength. Some were 70% weaker than ordered. Some were 90% weaker. In the worst cases, the medications contained less than 5% of the active ingredient the doctor had prescribed. 45 patients were identified as having received significantly diluted chemotherapy from Courtney's pharmacy. 45 people who had trusted the medical system, who had endured the horror of cancer treatment, who had believed they were fighting for their lives with every available weapon. But they'd been fighting with water. The investigation expanded rapidly. The FBI brought in forensic accountants who traced Courtney's finances, documenting the enormous profits he'd generated through his scheme. They interviewed patients, doctors, and other pharmacists. They examined hundreds of prescriptions, comparing what had been ordered against what had been dispensed. The scope was staggering. Courtney hadn't limited his dilutions to 1 or 2 drugs or a handful of patients. He had systematically, over the course of years, diluted thousands of prescriptions for dozens of different chemotherapy medications. The evidence suggested he'd been doing this since at least 1992, nearly a decade of calculated medical fraud. On August 24, 2000, 3 days after the initial search, Robert Courtney was arrested at his home. He was charged with product tampering, adulterating drugs, and misbranding federal crimes that carried potential sentences of decades in prison. The community reacted with shock and horror. How could this happen? How could a respected pharmacist, a man who'd served the community for years, commit such monstrous acts? Patients who'd been treated at his pharmacy began calling their doctors, desperate to know if their medications had been compromised. Families who'd lost loved ones to cancer began asking terrible questions. Did my mother die because of him? Would my father have survived if he'd received real chemotherapy? The answers, in many cases, were unknowable. Cancer is complex. Even with proper treatment, many patients don't survive, proving that any individual death resulted specifically from diluted chemotherapy was nearly impossible. But the statistical evidence was damning. Among Courtney's patients, survival rates were lower than expected. Response rates were worse than national averages. People who should have lived died instead. Robert Courtney's trial began in December 2001. The federal courthouse in Kansas City became the stage for a legal proceeding that would captivate the nation and force a reckoning with questions about trust, greed, and the medical system's vulnerabilities. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. They presented pharmacological evidence showing the precise dilutions Courtney had made. They brought forward financial records documenting his profits. They called expert witnesses who explained exactly what effect these dilutions would have on cancer patients. They showed the jury prescription after prescription, each one a betrayal, each one potentially a death sentence. But the most powerful testimony came from the victims themselves, the patients who had survived, who had endured cancer treatment believing they were receiving proper care, only to learn they'd been systematically defrauded. Patricia Dowell took the stand, a breast cancer survivor who'd received chemotherapy from Courtney's pharmacy in 1998. She described the fear of diagnosis, the hope that treatment offered, the agony of side effects. She talked about losing her hair, about nausea so severe she couldn't eat for days, about the exhaustion that made every moment a struggle. And then she described learning that her chemotherapy had been diluted, that the suffering she'd endured was for nothing, that her cancer could have killed her because of one man's greed. "I trusted him," she said, her voice breaking. "I trusted the entire system, and he betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. He played with my life like it meant nothing." David Chen testified about his father, Thomas, who died of lymphoma in 1997. "We'll never know if proper treatment would have saved him," David said. "We'll never know if my children could have known their grandfather. That uncertainty is its own kind of torture." Courtney himself appeared diminished in court, no longer the confident, successful pharmacist, but a middle-aged man facing the consequences of his actions. His defense attorneys argued that he'd never intended to kill anyone, that he'd convinced himself the diluted medications were still effective, that financial pressure had clouded his judgment. The prosecution countered with devastating logic. Courtney was a trained pharmacist. He understood oncology. He knew exactly what chemotherapy dosages were required to fight cancer effectively. He'd made a conscious choice, repeated thousands of times over nearly a decade, to prioritize profit over human life. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. On December 17, 2001, they returned a verdict: guilty on 20 counts of tampering with consumer products, adulterating drugs, and misbranding. Each count carried a maximum sentence of 10 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. On December 5, 2002, Judge Autry Smith delivered Courtney's sentence. He spoke directly to the defendant, his words carrying the weight of institutional authority and moral judgment. "You were in a position of trust," Judge Smith said. "Patients relied on you to provide medications that could save their lives. Instead, you betrayed that trust in the most profound and harmful way imaginable. The scope of your crime is almost incomprehensible. You didn't make one mistake or succumb to a momentary temptation. You engaged in a systematic, calculated fraud that continued for years and affected hundreds, perhaps thousands, of patients." The sentence, 30 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Additionally, Courtney was ordered to pay $10.4 million in restitution to his victims. In the courtroom, some victims' families wept. Others sat in stony silence. For them, no sentence could restore what had been lost, the lives cut short, the suffering prolonged, the trust shattered irreparably. Courtney spoke briefly before being led away. "I'm sorry," he said, though the words felt hollow in the vast space between intention and consequence. "I never meant for anyone to die." But they had died. 45 confirmed victims, and potentially dozens more whose cases couldn't be definitively linked to his dilutions. The true body count would never be known with certainty. The Courtney case sent shockwaves through the American medical system, and triggered sweeping reforms in pharmaceutical oversight. Within months, new regulations were implemented requiring more rigorous tracking of chemotherapy drug inventories, making it much harder for pharmacists to systematically dilute medications without detection. States began implementing stricter auditing procedures for pharmacies that prepared Roman IV medications. The concept of just-in-time inventory management became standard, making it easier to match prescriptions filled against drugs purchased. Random inspections increased. Whistleblower protections were strengthened, encouraging healthcare workers to report suspicious patterns without fear of retaliation. But regulations can only do so much when the system fundamentally depends on trust. The relationship between patient and pharmacist, like that between patient and doctor, requires belief in the other person's competence and integrity. Courtney's crimes violated that sacred trust in ways that continue to resonate. For the survivors, the aftermath was complex and ongoing. Patricia Dowell's cancer remained in remission, but she struggled with anxiety every time she needed to fill a prescription. I find myself asking to see the pill bottle, checking the pharmacy's credentials, questioning everything. She told reporters years later, "The innocence is gone. I can never again assume that someone in healthcare has my best interests at heart." Some victims filed civil lawsuits against Courtney, his pharmacy, and the hospital system that had credentialed him. These cases resulted in settlements totaling millions of dollars, though no amount of money could restore health or bring back the dead. The hospital implemented new oversight protocols, including random testing of prepared medications and cross-verification of chemotherapy dosages. Dr. Verda Hunter, whose suspicions had helped break the case open, continued her oncology practice but became an advocate for pharmaceutical safety reforms. She testified before Congress, served on advisory boards, and worked to ensure that Courtney's crimes would lead to meaningful systemic changes. Robert Dilley, the sales representative whose attention to purchasing patterns had been crucial to the investigation, left the pharmaceutical industry. The weight of what he'd discovered, the realization that his delayed action might have cost lives, haunted him. In interviews, he expressed relief that the case was solved, but profound sadness about the victims who died before anyone noticed the pattern. Robert Courtney himself began serving his sentence at the Federal Medical Center in Lexington, Kentucky. He participated in prison programs, reportedly expressed remorse in group therapy sessions, and, according to prison records, became a model inmate. His projected release date was set for 2031, when he would be 82 years old, assuming he survived his incarceration. But for many, no amount of prison time would constitute adequate justice. How do you punish someone who played God with dozens of lives? How do you quantify the harm of stealing someone's chance at survival? How do you measure the rippling trauma inflicted on families who watched loved ones die, never knowing their suffering was orchestrated by calculated greed? The story of Robert Courtney remains a disturbing reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious malice. Sometimes it wears a white coat. Sometimes it speaks in soothing tones and fills prescriptions with a steady hand. Your energy level, in the space where institutional safeguards fail because we've assumed, wrongly, that certain betrayals are simply too monstrous to occur, but questions remain. How many other patients received diluted medications who were never identified? Were there other pharmacists in other cities engaging in similar schemes that haven't yet been discovered? How many deaths attributed to aggressive cancer or treatment resistance were actually cases of medical fraud? These questions haunt the regulatory agencies tasked with preventing such crimes. They motivate the ongoing reforms in pharmaceutical oversight. They remind us that vigilance cannot rest on the assumption of good faith alone, that systems must be designed with the understanding that trust, while essential, must be paired with verification. To this day, the Research Medical Tower operates its pharmacy under transformed protocols, with layers of oversight that didn't exist before Courtney's arrest. The staff who work there carry the weight of history, knowing that their workplace was once the site of one of medicine's most profound betrayals. They check and double-check dosages. They welcome audits. They understand that their profession's credibility was damaged by one man's crimes and must be rebuilt through the meticulous work of thousands. And on quiet evenings, when former patients sit in treatment rooms receiving chemotherapy, when the Roman IV feeds medication into their veins and they close their eyes and hope that this poison, coursing through them, will kill the cancer before it kills them, some of them really wonder whether they can trust that what they are receiving is real. That uncertainty, that tiny seed of doubt planted by Robert Courtney's betrayal, may be his most enduring legacy. The knowledge that the people tasked with healing us are, in the end, fallibly human, capable of both extraordinary compassion and unspeakable cruelty. If this journey through one of medicine's darkest chapters resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the fragility of trust in systems we depend on for survival, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in institutional silence that deserve to be examined. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, and comment sharing your perspectives on medical ethics, oversight, and the systems meant to protect us. How do we balance trust with verification? How do we prevent future Robert Courtneys without becoming so paranoid that the patient-provider relationship collapses entirely? These are questions worth exploring together. Until next time, remember that the most dangerous monsters rarely look like monsters at all. They look like neighbors, like professionals, like people we trust. Stay vigilant, stay questioning, and never assume that institutional safeguards are foolproof, because they're operated by humans, and humans, as history repeatedly demonstrates, are capable of anything.